Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending our talk today. The talk will be OpenSSL Deep Dive, the good, the bad, and the not so ugly. Before we get started, let's give everybody about 1 minute or so to be able to join. Thank you. Hello, my name is Frank Catucci. I'm the CTO and head of security research here at Invicti Security, and with me today is Dan Murphy.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dan. As Frank noted, I'm the distinguished architect here at Invicti. I have been doing security for over 20 years now. It's a subject about which I'm passionate. And today we're going to talk about something that is not necessarily related to Invicti's primary line of business, but is something interesting that we kind of came across and a bit of a narrative, a story to tell you about a recent security incident and some details about what happens behind the scenes.
Thanks, Dan. So today we'll take a brief look at the agenda. We'll actually take a look at what OpenSSL is, basically where it is used, the adoption rate of OpenSSL across the internet, some strengths, some weaknesses, associated vulnerabilities, some difficulties, and doing a deep dive into the exploitation of some of those vulnerabilities. The extreme complexity in which is required to efficiently exploit, some common mitigations, as well as a conclusion that will probably show you that maybe some of the hype and some of the worries behind OpenSSL and the associated vulnerabilities are not necessarily, let's say, really rooted into the kind of fact and actual impact in your organization. So just at a high level, I would like to introduce Invicti as a whole. Invicti is a company that was born out of the two companies of NetSparker and Acunetics. The merger occurred some years ago. So if you're familiar with NetSparker or Acunetics and the DAST products that each had, you will be very probably in tune to what we do. Primarily DAST, we also offer SCA or software composition analysis, as well as IAST in that interactive application security testing. Some quick facts: our headquarters are in Austin, Texas. We're above 400 employees. We have around greater than 3,600 customers, and our apps secured are nearly 1 million at this point. And the biggest thing that we're proud of is the 111% essentially with growth and some net retention. So we definitely have the ability to deliver satisfactory and above and beyond expectation in the DAST and application security space. Thanks. So the first thing we'll take a look at here is, what is OpenSSL? OpenSSL is essentially a robust commercial grade open source software toolkit for the general purpose of crypto and secure comms. The project is essentially managed by the OpenSSL technical committee. Again, it's open source, and this comes straight from their page. Now, what's interesting to note here is that OpenSSL, in its name in itself, is a very open source software project. Now, that being said, it's highly adapted and even higher adoption rate across the internet and in commercial platforms as well. So if we look at some usage statistics here, this is very interesting to note. So we look at the usage in the top 1 million websites essentially across the internet. We look from 2011 essentially to present day. We have some dips and some trends there, but as you can see, the adoption rate in the usage of OpenSSL is quite high across the internet. We're looking at adoption rates here, especially from the US statistics, that essentially we have 13 million sites that are live and historical that have used OpenSSL or are using OpenSSL. The top 1 million websites, we have over 5%. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that this is only public data that's available, meaning that if you were to take a look at OpenSSL usage in internal applications or across internal infrastructure within organizations, you'd see a much higher adoption rate. And that being said, it's very, very widely used across the internet as well as across corporate infrastructure as a whole.
And here we have kind of the obligatory XKCD comic that really kind of shows in visual format exactly what we're talking about here. OpenSSL is one of those pieces of software that is ubiquitous. It's like plumbing. You don't necessarily see it, but it's there. And it's the pipes that powers so much software that we use day to day. It is open source, and it's maintained by a group of individuals that, frankly, we're very thankful to have maintaining it, because this piece of software is in so many offerings. As you have your packets traverse the internet on a day, it's very, very likely that you are having that HTTPS that is, appears in front of almost every URL with which we interact daily, is likely going through, at least for some percentage of sites, through this tiny little brick that we have in the bottom right that is OpenSSL. So even if it's something that a software project doesn't necessarily know that they have a dependency on OpenSSL, there are a great number of Linux-based tech stacks that certainly use it. It's always there, and it's a domino that really does hold up quite a number of projects.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, so we take a look here at some more usage statistics, geographical based especially, right? So we know that the US in particular is probably one of the leading consumers or users of OpenSSL. Those leading countries, it's important to note here, highly industrialized, modern technology based and focused countries, right? United States, Japan, South Korea, China, et cetera. And so the usage there is very, very widely adopted. So therefore, any impact of that is going to be felt worldwide and across many, many modern countries and infrastructures. If we take a look at the top websites using OpenSSL, there's some interesting statistics. So if we look at DC Inside is essentially a Japanese version of Reddit, if you will. We're looking at around 200 plus million monthly visits, basically flowing through OpenSSL or utilizing OpenSSL. And that's just on that side. Now, many of you may be involved or very aware of the Forbes.com website, or even members of the Forbes Technology Council. You can see there that we're looking at over 100 million monthly visits that flow through OpenSSL. Just as we take a look at these statistics, it's just a reminder of the volume of traffic and the dominance that really occurs on the internet that flows through something so critical. Top industry verticals are also something I also take a look at because, high tech, right? Science and education, 10%, computer electronics around 5%. The others is interesting. And I say that in particular because others is pretty much everywhere else that doesn't fall neatly into these categories, and or is internal usage as well that may not have a specific category identified. But if we're looking here, we know that the predominance, right? Again, the modern leading countries here, US, Japan, China, et cetera, the amount of usage, the industry verticals, science, education, and tech, being a very, very predominant user, and therefore that impact of using OpenSSL is felt worldwide on a very, very grand scale.
Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive into CVE 2022-3786, which we'll get to the details into later in the talk. But some of you may be asking, well, why is this particular bug on which we're focusing so interesting? And absent any context, frankly, it isn't. Security bugs happen all the time, but many times they don't make it into the wild. Typically, they're found, fixed, and ultimately don't cause too much trouble. Now, I come at this with the perspective of a software developer, an engineer who helps build security tools. And frankly, one will see security, you'll see 0 days often just get nipped in the bud all the time. Off by one errors, which is the class of bug that is important for the story of this particular vulnerability. they will appear in an editor and they'll be fixed quickly and quietly. Most of the time, these things are like waves in the ocean that are lapping peacefully against the shore. So, for context, why is it that last Halloween, around the time when this advisory became public, many of us were on Slack feverishly speculating about a forthcoming patch from OpenSSL? Maybe, just maybe, some of the more focused of us have had rigged up a script to git pull the OpenSSL repository every few minutes and play some epic music, Carmen Burena's O Fortuna, if a mysterious MR suddenly appeared. Now, the reason that everyone was so excited back on Halloween about this advisory lies in context. It lies in history. For many of us, there was a sense of deja vu, or perhaps more accurately, PTSD. So a little bit of a story interlude. Almost 10 years ago, nearly to this day, there was a simple RFC that was proposed. It was named and numbered as RFC 6520, Transport Layer Security, TLS, and Datagram Transport Layer Security, DTLS, Heartbeat extensions. Now, at the time, this was the sort of weird and esoteric RFC that really only appealed to hyper-focused turbo nerds who were a little bit too enthusiastic about open source cryptography. Now, around that time, I was working on the data path and the cryptographic layer for a product called Cisco AnyConnect, a VPN client. Last time I checked in with the guys there, my somewhat janky original code was still in there, still being used. And every 3 weeks, even to this day, I still see that icon bouncing up and down on someone's screen that's shared in Zoom. And I wonder how many millions of packets are flowing through my code that used OpenSSL even today. Frankly, that's somewhat terrifying. But I digress. My point is that around the time when Heartbleed hit, I was definitely in that target audience of cryptographic turbo nerds. I was maintaining patches for OpenSSL. I'd even built kind of a user layer heartbeat protocol on top of DTLS, the Datagram Transport Security Layer. So I was into the subject. Now, if we fast forward 2 years, that RFC is a little bit more widely known than just to kind of the tiny community for whom it was intended. And that is because of the logo that you see to the right. Well, that logo and perhaps the shocking CVE with which it went along. Seriously, the logo is pretty amazing. If you ever want to do a BuzzFeed style clickbait article, we should totally use security vulnerability logos that AppSec professionals don't want you to see. Number one will shell shock you. But that logo is important because Heartbleed hit hard. It was an example of a no-auth required exploit for OpenSSL. This was on TV. I remember relatives asking me about this bug because it was so widespread. Now, Heartbleed stopped short of full remote code execution, but what it did was it allowed for reading arbitrary data from the memory space of a remote process. The way it worked was similar to ping, a program for sending an ICMP echo packet intended to be served back to the sender with the exact same contents. Both Heartbleed, vulnerable implementations would just trust the client's length field for the Heartbleed, that the heartbeat was valid, even if the actual packet came up short. So a malicious client could say, hey, I just sent you 64 kilobytes of data and actually only send like 5 bytes. And what it would get back would be 65,530 bytes of delicious sushi grade raw heap data. And that's raw heap data from a very high value region of memory. It's a section that has a scratch buffer of HTTP plain text that is freshly decrypted. It's the place where all the security secrets are stored. Now, I'm not sure if you're aware, but sometimes there's a bit of hype in the security industry. So seeing is often believing. And I and many others remember exactly where they were when Heartbleed dropped. I remember the first time that I saw it in action. I was working at a startup at the time. A bunch of us had broken off from the mothership and we were blazing our own path, free of our corporate masters, building a dedicated security appliance. Now, we had done things right. We had dropped privileges, isolated memory spaces. We even had hardware accelerated cryptography for the data path. But the management plane, the part of the software that was used to kind of exercise control and administrative functions, that was just software. It was Nginx sitting on top of, you guessed it, that domino from before, OpenSSL. I remember downloading and running a proof of concept and targeting this fortress of software that we had just built. And it was a fortress that we were proud of because we had done everything right. And I remember that feeling. My jaw just dropped open as I looked at Wireshark, the packet capture tool, and I saw it there, an unencrypted fragment of an HTTP header with authorization basic and a juicy looking base 64 string. Now, this was on port 443 HTTPS, which is supposed to be fully encrypted. And when that base 64 was decoded, I was looking at some scary letters, ADMIN, that's admin colon, and the keys to the kingdom, the master administrative credentials for the whole security appliance, just sitting there, fished out of memory by an attacker. Everything that we had done right was just undone in an instant, and anyone on the internet could do the same. Frank, what are your memories? What do you remember about where you were when Heartbleed hit?
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I think PTSD is a great explanation here for anything OpenSSL that comes out. And the reason why is precisely what Dan mentioned. Where was I? I was in a boardroom of one of the largest home improvement retailers in the United States. And we were doing, AppSec consulting work, if you will. And this is right the day of probably hours within the release of proofs of concept and things of that nature for Heartbleed. So there we are in the boardroom, connected to a hotspot, if you will. So to make sure that we were isolated from the corporate network, we were connected to I believe it was a little Verizon hotspot via cell signal or something of that nature. At that time was not as advanced as today, but what we were doing was we were running proof of concept code against the e-commerce site and looking at live data transactions. What we were able to pull was actual, like you mentioned, PII as well as PCI sensitive data in plain text from an external internet connection to be able to see live transactions as they were occurring on the e-commerce site. Now, what this means, fully supposedly encrypted connections where customers were doing their shopping and ordering and registering securely with our great little this site is secure symbol essentially, and being able to pull that data, that the personal identifying information, credit card information, etc., session information directly from the e-commerce web server. Now, again, as you mentioned, this is fully anonymous from the internet. This is not necessarily any kind of privileged access. That being said, the feeling and sentiment in the room was very dire, right? We have violations of trust, first of all. We have a vulnerability that is affecting almost every major website across the internet. But more importantly, we have direct violation of policy and compliance standards that have some very, very real ramifications. So the overall feeling in that boardroom was very much a feeling of dread. We need to get our heads and our hands around this immediately and mitigate this as soon as possible. The impact for this was very, very real. And that's something that I will probably never forget.
Yeah. Now, Heartbleed fell short of full remote code execution, but it did a tremendous amount of damage and it had so much awareness, and it was a critical severity CVE. So for context, when this most recent, back in November, end of October, when there were rumors that there was another critical severity that was coming for OpenSSL, everyone took an immediate interest. And the rest of this presentation, we're going to kind of go in and talk about the details and talk about sometimes when there is so much hype, how you can dig in and better separate the signal from the noise. But first, let's go in and see whether or not we can do a demo of exactly what that vulnerability looks like.
So as we begin the demo here, we'll see the admin name, username, and the admin password. Just to make sure, we're going to analyze the JavaScript here in the console and take a look at what was typed in the raw value, and we can see it was password 1. We're just verifying that's what we typed in there with the console for the JavaScript. All right, now we'll actually look and run the attack. Boom. What we're taking a look at there was the raw data coming from that request. And in that data, we have that password in plain text. Now, this is something that's definitely not supposed to be there. This is something that's very impactful. And the amount of damage that this was doing was very real. So when we talk about the bad, I would say that Heartbleed is that thing that lived in all of our minds to show you just how bad it really can be.
Exactly. So for timeline events, everyone was wondering, hey, could this happen again? Could there be another one of these CVEs that was just as bad as that magical attack that you just witnessed that managed to sniff out passwords without any real interaction from just pressing a button and having anyone on the internet able to read data? So the timeline events were that on November 1st, OpenSSL issued this security advisory, and it disclosed two vulnerabilities. The one that we're going to be digging into today is CVE 20223786, which had the inspiring name of X509 email address 4-byte buffer overflow. There was another one that was also addressed that was not rumored as a critical, so one that we didn't really take a look at. However, the rumors were that we were going to have a critical, and fresh in everyone's mind was that experience, that Heartbleed horror story that many of us recollect. And there was widespread speculation. There was an instance where there was a rumor that this was going to be critical, but an absence of real information that described where it was. So you had tons of speculation, both internally. We were spitballing ways that we could somehow detect versions of OpenSSL by hashing handshakes, as well as on Twitter. There was a ton of speculation across the security community about what was coming, what could be next. Now, whenever there's a cycle of hype, the right thing to do is to dig in and see exactly what the reality is. So when that patch did come out, there was a happy ending. It was downgraded from a critical to a high, but still, it's worth digging in to understand exactly why. So for the next sequence here, we'll spend some time looking at that bug and just analyzing exactly what caused all of this concern and how exploitable would it have been in the real world? Why was it downgraded? And the lesson here is really narrative. It's to understand that in the world of security, there's a sea of noise with which we as professionals engage with all the time. We really do have to dig in and understand the details to be able to separate the noise from the actual interesting bits. So let's look at our patch down here at the bottom of the screen. We see all of this furor that had engulfed kind of the security world for a few days was all due to a single character. On lines 184 and 183, we can see that the fix here was an equal sign. It was changing that if written out is greater than max out to be greater than or equals. And those of you, while there'll be some code here, the important part is the narrative takeaway. This wasn't off by one. This meant that this loop that was doing some special work was going just a little bit too far. And we'll look into the implications of what going a little bit too far can mean from a security perspective. Now, this was along with 3,133, not 31337, which would have been nice, but this was the only interesting line out of all those changes. But this is kind of the core of all of this uproar, of all of this concern. So let's look at the details and see exactly what would an attacker have to do to be able to exploit this. Now, at Invicti, one of the things that we enjoy is kind of using those same techniques that the bad guys use to make sure that we really know that something is real and worth kind of bringing to attention of AppSec teams and of developers. So for this, I want to introduce this concept. I love words, and this is a word that's actually particularly relevant that we're using as a metaphor to kind of accompany all the the deep details of the code and how it works. But the metaphor here is this syzygy, and a syzygy is a really cool word that means that you have effectively planets that are in alignment. And that's the metaphor that we're going to be pushing for the rest of the talk, is taking a look at the details of this vulnerability and talking about, well, just because it's a high, what has to happen for it to actually be able to be attacked? Because understanding those details is key to understanding how, as an AppSec professional, you decide to prioritize, you decide to take action. There's so many vulnerabilities with which we deal with all the time, and figuring out the context is so important to understanding what is worth fixing. So let's go in and take a look at how we can make the planets align to make this attack happen. Now, the first thing that we have to take a look at is understand the way that an attacker would try to exploit this vulnerability. Now, if we take a look at this code and understand exactly where it is, we need to know that vulnerable code, that missing equal sign that we showed before. How do you get there from the outside world? Well, it turns out that it happens in a somewhat unusual flow. It happens when a server is requesting that a client provide it with a client certificate, which is a bit of a dusty corner of the type of handshake that is usually done. Some of you who have used somewhat internal websites may have seen a dialog that pops up where you have to choose a certificate, but frankly, 99% of the HTTPS sites that are on the public internet don't use client certificate authentication. It requires the configuration and maintenance of complex PKI infrastructure, public key cryptography infrastructure, and it's just something that you don't typically see. Now, if we dig further and try to understand, to make that first planet align that you see in our diagram on the right, this is not in every single version of OpenSSL. This flaw was introduced in a fairly modern vintage of OpenSSL that was released in way back in, well, actually not that far back, in 2021, which in the span of the lifetime of OpenSSL, which is ancient and venerable software, it's actually somewhat new. So we all know that everyone constantly upgrades software, so this should update, this should affect everyone, right? Well, no. In the real world, there's a lot of folks that are still on OpenSSL 1.1, which is a stable long-term branch. So this exploit would really only affect those who had upgraded OpenSSL fairly recently. It's also after normal certificate validation occurs. Now, that's actually very, very significant. And we'll go through and illustrate how an SSL handshake works, but this means that in order to even begin to attack this, an attacker must actually modify a legitimate client certificate that is issued. That means that the attacker is not just kind of sending something randomly over the wire. What they have to do is get effectively this passport. They have to get a certificate that has the exploit code embedded must be stamped and issued by a designated authority. That widens the scope. Unlike Heartbleed, that means you can't just show up and send some random bytes to a server. You have to attack the infrastructure, and you have to get this license printed that has the attack code. We'll kind of illustrate this by taking a look at an SSL handshake, what it looks like, and we'll show where in this sequence the attack happens. Now we're doing this as a duo. So Frank, if I could ask you to represent the client, and I'll represent the server here. What do we normally do? What's the first thing that happens when we negotiate an SSL handshake?
Right. So as a client, I'm going to come to you and say, hey, server, I would like to make a connection. And these are the cipher suites in which I speak. Which shall we use?
So the server, as we see in that second exchange, it'll respond authoritatively. It will generate some cryptographic seeds that are used for the rest of the exchange, and it will say, hey, client, today we are going to be talking AES-256 in Galois counter mode. It'll say, this is what we're going to do. Now, normally there's another short exchange with a change cipher spec finished, and then you start. But in this case, we see another exchange. We'll send down the server certificate to the client that says, these are my credentials. But in order for this attack to happen, there's something that's unusual. The server needs to then say, hey, I have shown you my credentials. Now you show me yours. It requests a client certificate. And Frank, what happens next from the client side?
The client's going to send back the validated certificate from the private and the public key.
Mm-hmm. And what the server is going to do is it's going to begin to parse that client certificate. And it's doing that to say, hey, has this been signed? Has this been issued? Is this passport that I see appropriately stamped by the authority that I trust? And that's where the explosion happens. It's in that parsing code. It's in those details where the server gets hung up and ultimately dies. Now, some details that we can go into is to find out, well, what is it in that client certificate that has to be poisoned? And to examine that, we'll take a quick aside to talk about Punycode. Now, Punycode is a way to encode international characters, UTF-8 characters that cannot normally be expressed in a simple ASCII data stream. Now, for the purposes of this talk, let's consider that we had a domain, and that domain was that tableflip.ie, right? So that's an old meme, but it does check out. Now, in that character, that kind of stylized dude that's flipping a table, you'll see if we express that as a series of bytes, we have two parentheses that are the rounded chubby cheeks of that character that you see there. Those in the representation of the byte stream are in ASCII. However, the juicy internals, that's all special characters. Those special characters can't be represented in a hex stream. So Punycode is a way to encode things that aren't normal characters in a stream of bytes. Problem is, it gets complex. If we look at kind of the details of that, typically there's a marker at the beginning, an XN dash dash, that indicates that it's time to get weird. Following that, there will be a sequence of bytes that represent the ASCII part. And you'll notice that those are contiguous. So those are right next to each other, not separated by kind of an adorable face and a square mouth as they are in the original. But then that mouth, that arm, those will be encoded in a weird sequence of bytes that come at the end. Now, the point here is what this means for code is a lot of nasty code that has to keep an index, keep state. It's going to be complicated. And in security, complexity often invites vulnerability. So let's take a look at what a bad guy would have to do for this. All right, so here's our second planet that's going to snap into alignment. Now, to attack this, the root certificate must contain something called a name constraint. So it has to have something that says, I only want to talk to clients that have a valid email address. And you can see that expressed here as in our valid use case, that email::xn. And some of you may recognize that hex encoding that we had in the previous slide, but that's our tableflip.ie domain. Now, we also need a leaf certificate. So this is the certificate that the client is going to be presenting to the server side. That has to have a subject alt name that has an ID on SMTP UTF mailbox, which is this big long OID, and that has to match the same domain. Now, the takeaway from this is that this means that we actually have to get the certificate authority to not only give a compromised certificate to the server must be configured to use it, and then we have to convince the certificate authority to actually issue a client certificate that has attack code inside of it. And that means that that step of getting that second planet into alignment, there is a lot of gravity necessary to do that. This is a very, very heavy lift. You would almost have to compromise. An attacker would have to hack the certificate authority. And if you're going to do that, there's a lot easier ways to actually end up stealing the credential. But let's go deeper, because even that makes this incredibly hard to exploit, but it's even harder. So if we dig in, at the bottom of the screen, we kind of see the call stack, the code. This is the public way in, checking the name constraints, right? Making sure that that passport is appropriately signed by an authority. And it's in that OSSL Punycode decode. And if we go into the details of that, we can kind of see where the problem is. But first, we do want to have an aside and talk a little bit about memory safety.
Sure. Yeah, I think memory safe languages and memory safe conversations are taking precedent lately. We see this as a trending topic in some of our research, as well as some external research happening by other companies as well. So memory safe languages. Let's take a look here at all of the open source vulnerabilities that have to do with memory safety broken down. Now, we all know immediately before you even, let's say that if you were blindfolded right now, you'd have things that pop into your mind. Okay, we know PHP has inherent vulnerabilities in that code base, and obviously Java has its own very unique and ubiquitous issues as well. However, if we take a look at this, we're looking at C code, right? C code in itself has the lion's share, if you will. Almost 50% of the total open source vulnerabilities are falling on C code. Now, why is that important? Well, C code is largely a foundation or a staple legacy code out there that is utilized in many open source libraries that have been on the internet, and open source code bases that have been available for use on the internet for quite some time. They do get maintained. However, the original and base language has some inherent memory vulnerabilities. And so this is a very a finite attack vector that's being utilized or that's being looked at on that type of basis. Now, Chromium project finds essentially that around 70% of serious security bugs are memory safety problems. So the Chromium project, Microsoft, Microsoft in itself, 70% of their CVEs are usually memory safety issues, right? We know this for a fact. Microsoft, Chromium project, Firefox's CSS subsystem, Ubuntu's Linux kernel, right? We're all talking around 65 to 75% of those vulnerabilities being found being memory vulnerabilities. And so when we fall back on that, let's take a little bit of a look at the impact of that in C code, especially, and memory safety type of languages, perhaps for future development and usage.
Yeah, and let's examine another aside here, stacks. Let's talk about stacks and how they work. And we'll talk about very briefly, when you have a memory unsafe language like C, typically, and these examples here are a little bit simplified for the purposes of presentation with 4-byte pointers and things like that. But you'll typically have a stack that as it grows, it allocates new local storage. And when a frame is called, we had our trace that showed how we got into the OpenSSL code that was vulnerable a few slides ago. It's going to be a stack, just like a stack of plates at a buffet line, that has the local context for each one of those function calls. Typically, it'll have a region of memory that contains local variables, but also has something that tells you where you were called from, so that when the routine exits, it knows where to go back to. It knows how to pop off the top plate on that stack and go back to where it came, so that it can unwind and call the original code. Now, as you see here, in a good stack, everything fits into the nice space that is allocated for it. But in a bad stack, as the memory address grows up, it can actually burst out of the stack space that is allocated. And we can have something in code that has an off by one error, like the exploit that we're talking about today. You can actually have something that overflows. So you could have some 4 bytes caused by a missing equal sign in a comparison can bleed out of that designated zone and into a region of memory that might be able to cause some problems. So that's our bad. That will usually lead to a crash or something. But the ugly is when an attacker who knows what they're doing takes advantage of that and crafts a special recipe into those 4 bytes that allows it to create a fake stack that, when it is popped off, will have some malicious code that will have shellcode, code that will effectively do whatever the attacker wants, and a fake return address that will jump into that no-op padded shellcode. So even with those 4 bytes, in theory, an attacker that is talented can hijack and have that do whatever they want. But let's play with it. Let's try to separate some of the noise and see if we can get that to happen. So as an attacker, we have to think, well, what do those 4 bytes of overflow get us? What's the neighborhood? The previous example was idealized. You don't always have the buffer right contiguous to something juicy. So you have to look at the neighbors. You have to see whether or not those neighbors are going to be, something interesting. So in this case, I've annotated the actual code that is vulnerable. I walked through the OpenSSL and added that this is our buffer that will be overridden there. It is a buff, but the neighbors that are right next door to it, well, there's something called results that are nearby. That probably isn't that interesting. And in practice, nowadays, modern compilers have changed things so that the padding stack layout is not really linear. It's not always the same as it used to be. So the practice of actually trying to attack this gets a lot harder. But hey, let's try. Let's understand, right? So there's a great ancient, but still incredibly educational paper that was published in Frac magazine many years ago called Smashing the Stack for Fun and Profit. And here we examine smashing stacks in 2023. It's not that fun. And it's definitely not as profitable as it used to be. So let us shift our final planet into alignment. Let's allow for a world where we had a simplified setup where we had something right next to an interesting neighbor where those 4 bytes were interesting. In this case, this actual vulnerability, that 4 bytes was padding almost universally. So nothing bad was able to happen. But let's, again, in the spirit of exploration, in the spirit of reducing noise, let's create a setup where we simulate this and actually have some vulnerable code and just play with it and determine, well, what do modern stacks do to protect us? So we're going to shift our final planet into alignment for our syzygy and see what happens. Now, this is our example code. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but you'll notice that this loop is very similar to the vulnerable code that we saw before. We still have that written out greater than max size. And in the real world, that was greater than or equal to max size. So what we've done here is taken that vulnerability and kind of distilled it into something we can do some experiments on, something that we can play with. And in this case, what we're going to do is see whether or not we can get what happens when we write some code that tries to exploit this. So I'll narrate. You don't have to follow along to the code, but in theory, what we've done here is we've shrunken a buff and created 4 bytes, and we put something on the stack, a blast radius variable. Now we're simulating an attack payload that has 3 words of legitimate content, and then some evil code at the end, that 1337C0DE, the leet code that is a stand-in for our attack. So when we build this by default and we run it inside of a debugger, well, what happens when we overflow that buffer? Well, by default, if we take a look at the backtrace, it stops. Well, that's weird. It stopped with this sig abort. So that means that we actually didn't get to the point where we tried to do something. If we look at a backtrace here, we can see that we're in a very explicit thing called stack check fail. Now, what was that? That meant that an attacker wasn't able to do damage. An attacker was stopped. What is that? What happened? The answer is that when we try to overflow into that blast radius variable, it's interrupted, and it's interrupted by a technology that tries to prevent us from doing any damage. Modern compilers will put something in that is a guard byte. It's almost like a castle wall around a buffer that will be used to protect it. If we dig in a little bit more, we can even find that the location of that buffer wasn't where we expected it to be. It's actually negative 20 bytes off of where it should be. And that's because modern compilers are doing something special. They are taking those buffers, they're moving them from kind of a directly contiguous to the safe frame pointer that you see on the right, and moving it into kind of a safe zone and applying some protections. So again, as thinking like the bad guy, let's play around with it and see whether or not we can do anything different. So here, this time, we're going to run again and see what happens this time. So in this case, when we run, we are able to actually overflow things. Now, the reason that we overflow things, we change some parameters of the buffer. And if we then kind of modify this a little bit further, we can see that we're stopping it. I'll kind of go through this a little bit more quickly. But what we see is that we're hitting some defenses that are trying to block some access. So we'll go back to the original side. And now what we're going to do is build this with shields down. So we have this no stack protect option that we can pass to the compiler. This is going to turn off the inherent protections that are there. So let's see, if we did this, can we actually write into that blast radius? Can we get something interesting to happen if we turn off the shields? Now, it's worth keeping in mind that, yeah, we were able to do something here. We did get our lead attack code into an interesting location. And we can see that in this case, the corruption occurred and was not actually caught. But this is, again, we're talking then about another planetary shift where your secure OpenSSL stack, in order to exploit this, would have to be compiled with something that is explicitly turning off protections. And we can kind of keep going. We can kind of see what happens if we can push it a little bit further. If we end up kind of playing with this again and again, we, as an attacker, as someone who's trying to embrace that same methodology that the bad guys would use to exploit this, we can get a little bit further. And so we can try to modify things. We can start tweaking values and see whether or not we can induce something that causes a crash. And when we do that, what we're going to do here is kind of simulate, well, you know, what happens if we put some limits so we can get into a Goldilocks zone where our attack payload is not too big and not too small. And here we're going to simulate what an attacker, again, who has exploited that client certificate and has put some code inside of there. Well, what can we do if we get a little bit further and play with this a little bit more? Now, what we see here is we've induced a crash. And if we look up, we can see that we are actually able to corrupt that frame with a value that came from the attacker. So that, going back to our slide that we had before, what we're doing here is simulating that if we had everything contiguous, if we had built this code without the protections turned on, if we had kind of a perfect world for an attacker, then what we could do is we could create that real ugly stack. We could create something that has a fake frame. So we've showed that, yes, you actually can get this to happen, but realistically, in order to do this, so much has to align and so much has to come together to make this possible. Frank, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the mitigations that are present in the modern world to make this so hard for an attacker to exploit?
Yes, mitigations, modern mitigations. As we take a look at this, and Dan mentioned, it's not necessarily, well, it is, but not necessarily only all of the planets and planetary bodies that need to align, but also you have to have data in the neighboring areas that can be useful. We see that our neighbors are not holding anything of value in these particular instances. Now, that being said, we have mitigations that go beyond that, mitigations at the code level and the non-code level. So if we take a look at the mitigations, if you will, from the canary standpoint, right? Stack guards. These are written in memory right before the return pointer. Essentially, it's initialized to a random value before any function is invoked, and it's verified when that function returns. We know that if we try to compromise this, we get an early warning of tampering, and essentially the program will terminate. Now, we would have to not use any canaries and completely disable that for an attack like this, or a stack guard to be avoided that signals the abort process or the termination of the process. So that's one thing that we'd have to do. Another code level vulnerability would be ASLR. ASLR is address space layout randomization. So with ASLR, what we do is we're changing the memory layout of the stack program at launch. So in other words, the attack has to attempt to jump into a compromised region of memory is far harder because there's no fixed positions, meaning it's randomized. Now, how you can't even brute force those randomizations anymore. We're going to have to get to a point where we know where that attack has to occur within the memory address layout. Now, ASLR is going to prohibit that from happening. So another thing we'll have to do beyond not using canaries or stack guards is to disable any ASLR. We have non-executable stacks as well. So we know that there are portions of that stack that cannot execute. These are things that are built in directly. Again, code level mitigations that exist in modern development and modern code. These are all things that would have to be manually turned off for this exploitation to occur. Next, we have, if all of these things did align, what could we do from an emergency standpoint to block this at a non-code level? Well, we could implement rule sets in IPSs, rule sets in web application firewalls. And we can create these rule sets, if you will, or these rules using specific regexes and payloads to be blocked within that IPS. We can send a TCP reset packet if we see something of that coming across that wire. We can block it at layer 7 with a WAF, or we can use a combination of a network based IPS and a WAF to block that twice. Now, we need all of these code level and non-code level mitigations to essentially fail or not be present. But we could use these mitigations again if there's a vulnerability that happens to be able to be exploited utilizing the memory that is the memory type of attacks that were used for something like this Punycode attack in nature. Finally, we have the ability to patch and upgrade, means that we see these patches come out almost immediately, and then the proof of concepts usually, hopefully, will follow. From that perspective, what we have is the ability to patch in a very quick manner. Now, this might have a variety of impacts, so the patch may not be as immediate as you would like, but the ability to patch and test is there, especially in as these vulnerabilities are being released and planned on more ahead of time. And having a good SCA for visibility. Having good software composition analysis, knowing where these vulnerable components, libraries, files, where this OpenSSL version X that is very specific occurs within your external facing networks, as well as your or apps, and in your internal ones as well. So having a good SCA for vulnerability that jumps directly to the code level shows you exactly where this possible component is being used, and then be able to implement those mitigations based on the specific usage, and knowing that if it is actually exploitable, with being able to actually look at how those functions are being called. So all of these are more modern level mitigations that essentially had to be either manually disabled or totally disregarded to be able to exploit vulnerabilities such as these. So this is important to note that a lot of this is no longer very feasible or easy to utilize within that attack vector.
Mhm. Excellent. So in conclusion, downgrading this CVE 2022 to 3786, this was downgraded from critical, and I think we've showed why this was the right call. And actually, Frank, do you want to mention some of the background for this that happened within the research community?
Yeah, so one of the things I would like to state here is that we have an immense amount of researchers, just as we do developers, that are maintaining and keeping this open source healthy and alive and stable. Our researchers out there, not just our researchers, but security researchers worldwide, Polar Bear in particular in this case, are doing a tremendous service, not only to every private and public industry, but also to software as a whole. These researchers are critical in proper disclosure and fixing of these vulnerabilities. Let's say that a researcher or someone nefarious, a criminal, happens to find these and not disclose these, but sell to the highest bidder instead. We have a much different type of impact, one that may or may not go detected for some time, one that can be weaponized or used in nation state, one that can actually have actual life impact for if healthcare facilities are impacted or emergency management. So these researchers in particular are doing a wonderful job, and it's important to note, and our continuing type of moving the needle forward for the prevention and that research going forward for responsible disclosure. So huge shout out to our internal as well as our non-affiliated researchers for a lot of the work that we do and that the community is doing as a whole to bring the eyes and focus on these type of vulnerabilities.
Mm-hmm. And many eyes really truly does make for shallow bugs. Now, it's funny, when we were finalizing some of these slides, we found that this is probably not the last that we've heard of this particular code. As I said before, complexity often invites vulnerability. And we just had at the beginning of February another CVE that was in the same C code that we were looking at earlier. So this might not be the last. When we have complexities, when we have kind of memory unsafe languages, those two things do conspire to often create code that may be problematic. But in this particular example of CV 2022-3786, I think we have shown that the planets really did have to align to make this an RCE. We have to have a compromised certificate authority, compromised client certificate. We need to have a server that is configured to request client credentials from those who connect to it, which is rare. We have to have a recent vintage of OpenSSL that falls within a fairly narrow window in order to be vulnerable. And finally, we did a deep dive and took a look at, well, we need a mythical stack layout that has an interesting area, an interesting neighbor that can be smashed if an attacker was able to exploit it. And we also would need a world where stack guards and canary blocks are not the default when compiling new code. So in summary, this particular thing that everyone was worried about, this particular vulnerability that was rumored to be a critical, it was less heartbleed and more paper cut.
Yeah, important to note, we didn't have an existing logo for this vulnerability when it came out, although I'm sure one was being developed and ready to go in case it really was impactful. So this paper cut logo is fairly accurate to the impact, I think, that we saw here. So
Yeah.
great aside there. Thanks, Dan.
Excellent. So thank you very much. This is the end of the presentation, and we hope that you found this helpful. And what we'll do now is kind of pause to take a few questions.
All right, thank you. For our first question that I see coming in right now, it said, you said this probably is not the last OpenSSL vulnerability. Do you see any big issues with OpenSSL in itself and how it's used that make it risky? Now, to answer that question, let me divide that up into two sections here. So I'm going to take the second section first. Do I see any big issues with OpenSSL itself or its use that makes it inherently risky? The answer there is yes and no. So no, not necessarily anything very plain and simple about saying OpenSSL in itself is risky. The fact of the matter is here that yes, it's written in C. The fact that it's written in C means that it's inherently a language that has memory safe type of vulnerabilities. And that's why there's a lot of those code level mitigations that already exist for those type of things. Now, why is there probably another vulnerability out there? Well, let's put it this way. We walked through adoption, we walked through the prevalence. Every time something like this comes out, we get more and more eyes on it, right? More and more people trying to take these attacks and go one step further, take a look at the code, go one step further, right? So the more eyes, the more popularity. And we know its adoption and usage across the internet makes it an extremely attractive target. So that being said, we still continue to use OpenSSL. I think OpenSSL is a very viable package for now and in the future, and it'll continue to be upgraded and used. And I'm not necessarily think that it's risky inherently by itself, but it will get additional attention. And it will get additional eyes from the research community as well as from criminal community. And you know, it is written in a language that has some inherent vulnerabilities to it. So especially in the memory space. So that's why I don't think it's the last OpenSSL vulnerability, but I do think things have changed dramatically from the earlier PTSD times of Heartbleed to more modern code level protections and things of that nature. So even though I don't think it's the last, I think that the chances that the severity of the impact will probably be a little bit less going forward, or at least we can hope. And that's my take on it.
Yeah, and actually, our next question is kind of similar. So the question is, this time it wasn't Heartbleed, but could we get another Heartbleed type bug in the future? Or are things somehow more robust now with ASLR and similar protections, and it's not likely that we can get something so bad? So as Frank mentioned earlier, you know, we actually are in a better state than we once were with the default settings that are on that allow for more safety, but never say never. We still see lots, as we demonstrated with some of those stats before, there's lots of memory unsafety exploits that happen. So if there's one thing that I could say that I've learned in security is that, you know, you can never, ever speak in absolutes, never say never. So while it's possible always that there could be another future Heartbleed, I do think that we're definitely in a better state now than we were when the original one happened. That's not to say, though, there always can be a rogue wave that hits.
Yeah, the rogue wave possibilities, especially. So I'm gonna go with the next question that I see. And it's, can you see a way to reduce everyone being so dependent on specific projects like OpenSSL, or is it inevitable with open source? So I have a thought here. I think that open source plays such a large part of modern development and modern application. I don't see that going away. I see it becoming more prevalent. We have things like OpenAI and things of that nature that are doing, you know, kind of code complete, if you will. And a lot of that comes from open source repositories, GitHub's Copilot, et cetera. So I don't see a way that we're going to be less dependent. What I'd like to see is more community effort as a whole to pay attention and support these open source projects. Open source is a vital part of almost every piece of software you use on your phone and your day-to-day life. And really, so I think the inevitability is just the usage. I think that we need, more eyes and more involvement. But open source is here to stay, and I really do think that it's something that is so integral into everyday part of your life that this is something that does deserve some more eyes and attention. But it is something that we're going to continue to be dependent on for the foreseeable future, in my opinion.
And last question is an interesting one. From a security standpoint, don't you think it's time to finally move to memory safe languages? Then we wouldn't get all of these overflow vulnerabilities. So a bit of a spicy take on that one is that uh, oftentimes there's a choice when building languages. Sometimes that choice comes down to speed versus functionality. Now, it is possible to write memory safe code in a language like C or C++. However, it's easy also to make mistakes. So I do think it's possible to adopt development processes that do make that safe. However, you can't argue with the evidence. When you see 70% of vulnerabilities being related to memory, it means you have to train everyone who is working in those languages. And that's why we have seen a rise of managed languages that make it harder to utilize unsafe constructs that can result in errors. I actually do see on the horizon some very interesting developments that I'd love to see in the next few years, more adoption of languages like Rust that actually do not compromise on speed and have the ability to compile down to native code that's fast and executable, but also make safe memory handling a part of the first order concern of the language. So I think that we're seeing some positive moves in that direction. I think we are getting a little bit better, and I actually, as a software developer, look forward to seeing what the next 5 years have in store.
Well
And
said, Dan.
yeah, and I think that's it for our questions. So thank you very much for your participation today. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks, everybody.